So I have a question for you. Have you ever been a part of something that you were kind of a full participant in, but you only were just going through the motions of that thing or that whatever that process was? Like you were there, but you're like, man, I'm just doing the bare minimum. Some of you are going, yeah, I'm doing that right now. No, I'm just kidding. No, that's happened to me probably more than I like to admit, but I remember one specific time I was in college. I was at part of my program in college where I got to have a few more choices of some classes that I was going to take, some electives that I needed to figure out. Now, in those electives, I still had certain requirements, so it wasn't just a free-for-all. I needed to pick amongst a couple of different options, and I remember one particular thing that I needed to get so that my degree could be complete, and I had some choices to make. And so some of those choices weren't I wasn't that excited about, but one particular class, I was like, man, that one looks better than the rest. And it was an English literature class. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, man, that doesn't sound like a great option. You should have seen the other options I had available, then you would understand. But on top of that, I got to see the reading list. And for me, someone like me, I started getting kind of excited about some of the authors that were mentioned there. And I was really looking forward to not just reading their stuff, but having discussions in our class about the things that these authors wrote. Be authors like Lewis or Tozier or Wright or Tolkien, or MacDonald, Plantinga, Van den Wegen, Kleeft. And so I saw those. I was like, man, this could be awesome. But the way the class actually worked is we spent 2 days discussing their stuff out of 16 weeks. The rest of the class was devoted to poetry. And at that point in my life, I didn't care what the motto meant, right? I just didn't care. Or our teacher's favorite author, Jane Austen. Now, based on that reaction, you guys had the same bummer experience that I did in that, because you probably didn't know any of those authors that I mentioned, but you all knew who Jane Austen was. And that was her favorite one. It was her favorite one to a point that was actually what our final presentation was about. And I wasn't that excited. I was doing the bare minimum through that point in the class. And then the day came for our presentation. There were 3 or 4 students that went ahead of me, and they were all saying these things like, Jane Austen is this great classic author. She brings up all these, blah, 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 all these things like this. And I was watching our teacher respond to the things that they were presenting, and her eyes were just lighting up. And I'm going, oh, man. And then it was my turn, and I really wanted to get a good grade in there. So I stood up, and I said, Jane Austen is a classic author, and she writes really good. And so Mrs. Swihart stops me, and she said, Mr. Pannone, I hear what you're saying, but I don't believe anything that you're saying. She goes, I want you to speak with some conviction here. I need you to speak honestly about these things. If you didn't know who Jane Austen was, she wrote a book called Pride and Prejudice, and we had to read this, all right? It was forced on me to read this. If that's your favorite book, I don't mean to offend you on this. You probably don't like my favorite book either, but it was not fun for me to read. And when she said, I need you to be honest, I looked at her and said, really? And she said, yes. I said, all right. The first sentence of Pride and Prejudice says this: it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. And my presentation went something like this. When Jane Austen wrote this, she did not want Nick Pannone to read the rest of it, all right? I think this is drivel. The whole rest of the book was bleh. I didn't want to do it. I read this because it was forced on me in class, and I had to do this. And so at the end of it, she talked about how she appreciated me being honest. She was disappointed that I didn't like the same book that she liked, blah, 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 blah. But the whole purpose of that was that she wanted me she wanted to test me in my commitment to the principles of that class. Now, all of us are often in seasons and situations and moments that will reveal our commitment to a particular thing or a particular person. And specifically, we have all or are going to experience moments that will test and reveal and show what our commitment to the Lord looks like. And we're coming to a point of that in our text this morning. We're going to be in 2 Kings chapter 2. You can turn there if you want. But we are in a point of Israel's history, of the people of God's history, where there's a divided kingdom. We started talking about that divided kingdom last week. and we looked at some of the ministry and the life of the prophet Elijah. The divided kingdom, northern kingdom Israel, southern kingdom Judah, different kings that go with this. Some of them are good, many of them aren't so good. And different prophets that help guide us spiritually through those times in the people of God's history, in the Hebrew people's history. So we looked at Elijah's time last week and some things that were happening there. Today we're in a chapter that is a chapter of transition. We move from Elijah's ministry, and we're transitioning now into Elisha's ministry. If you've been following along in the Bible recap, we got to read a whole bunch about Elisha, the prophet Elisha's time in his ministry. He was a prophet in Israel, a very charismatic prophet. But this chapter we're going to see is this transition. We're going to see a legacy passed from one to another, from one generation to another, and we're going to see what God does with a spiritual hunger. And we're asking the question, what does it look like to receive what God has for you and then to step into it with purpose, with intentionality, in meaningfulness? And so we're going to read in 2 Kings chapter 2. We're going to start in the first verse. And this is the story we see of this transition. Now, when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven by a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. And Elijah said to Elisha, "Please stay here, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. And the sons of the prophets who were in Bethel came out to Elisha and said, "Do you know that today the Lord will take away your master from over you?" And he said, "Yes, I know it. Keep quiet." Then in verse 4, Elijah said to him, "Elisha, please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Jericho." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they came to Jericho. The sons of the prophets who were in Jericho drew near to Elisha and said, "Do you know that today the Lord will take away your master from over you?" And he answered, "Yes, I know it. Keep quiet." Then Elijah said to him, "Please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. 50 men of the sons of the prophets also went and stood at some distance from them, as they both were standing by the Jordan. Then Elijah took his cloak and rolled it up and struck the water, and the water was parted to the one side and to the other, till the two of them could go over on dry ground. Let's pause there for a second. See what's going on here. Elijah travels back and forth from Gilgal to Bethel to Jericho to the Jordan. Now for us, we kind of look at that, like that's a lot of traveling, ping-ponging back and forth. There's roughly about 10 to 15 miles difference in all of those towns, all those cities right there. So they're not traveling a great distance, but each stop, we need to understand this, is filled with a rich spiritual history for the people of God. For us, it just seems like they're going ping-ponging back and forth. But this trip is mimicking the same stops that the people of God had when they entered into the promised land for the first time in the first 8 chapters of Joshua. Only this time they're doing it in reverse. Now for Joshua, when he's leading these people, he's bringing them into this promised land, and it's this new era that's beginning with God and the people of God. For Elisha, following Elijah on this trip, they're actually working on leaving an era behind them. For the people of God in Joshua, those first 8 chapters, they're asking, what's in store for us? Here on this trip that Elijah and Elisha are making, they're saying, look what's been done already. This route is a reminder of the Lord's commitment for his people from all generations. See, when Joshua led his people into these towns, they would establish these monuments. They would establish these visual reminders of what God was up to them. Had been up to with them. And then for Elijah and Elisha, they would probably go to these towns and they would see these visual reminders and say, see what the Lord has been doing? See what he's been up to? And then even at the end of this little trip, Elijah takes his cloak, some translations call it a mantle, takes it off of him, strikes the river, and the river parts. And it would certainly remind them of Moses parting the Red Sea. There are so many similarities of this Elijah to Elisha cycle compared to this Moses to Joshua cycle. In fact, the name Elisha means my God saves. And the name Joshua means the Lord is my salvation. And later on, we'll see the same type of pattern when John moves in, the ministry of John moves over to the ministry of Jesus, whose name means the Lord saves. And it's this repetition of this story over and over and over. But what we see here is a testing or a revealing of Elisha's commitment to this ministry. He refuses to leave Elijah's side. As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you, he says. Elisha was committed to this story till the very end. That's exactly how his time with Elijah actually started. Way back in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 19, 20, and 21, we see the story of Elisha's commitment to Elijah. You see, he's working on his family farm. He's got a couple dozen oxen that he's working with. They're all part of the plows, and they're just working this land. And we see like the weirdest job interview that's ever existed happen. Because the prophet Elijah shows up to the farm, sees Elisha, he takes off his cloak or his mantle and throws it on the shoulders of Elisha, and then he turns and walks away. And that's the interview. And Elisha immediately understands what has just happened. There has been a mantle that has been passed to him. He knows now the calling that he has. And so he goes and he finds Elijah and he says, hey, I'm in. I just need to go kiss my father and my mother goodbye. And he says, okay. And then this is what Elisha does. He goes to the oxen that he was working with, butchers them, takes the plows that he was working with on those oxen, cuts up the wood of the plows, starts this big bonfire, cooks the meat of the oxen. And what that communicates is there is no going back. We aren't turning back. It's kind of a reminder to us of a man named Hernan Cortez. Now, most of you probably don't know that name, but back in the 1500s, I think it was 1500s, Hernan Cortez, you know the story. He was a guy from Spain leading a group of people into Mexico, and they were starting to claim some land. They had landed on a particular beach, and the Aztecs of Mexico didn't like this Hernan Cortez guy and his people, so they started fighting him back, and they were pretty successful at it to a point where Cortez's people said, hey, Hernan, things aren't looking too good. And he said, that's okay, I've got an idea. And he did what every good leader does, and he ran out into the ocean. He burned all their boats. And he said, you know what? We're either going to do this or we're going to die doing it. And whether or not you think that tactic's good, you got to know that he was committed. Here, Elisha was committed. This job interview would be very similar to if you were to walk into a doctor's office, the doctor took off his lab coat, threw it on your shoulders, and next thing you know, you're performing surgery. That's what's happening for Elisha right here. Now, most scholars believe that from 1 Kings chapter 19 to our text in 2 Kings chapter 2 happened sometime between 8 and 18 years. So Elisha had a decade plus of following this prophet and learning and being discipled by him and studying him. But this is what his job was. His main job was to go and forage for food. And then occasionally he would have to wash the prophet's hands and his arms when he was performing some type of sacrifice. But the main thing that he had to do in this time was simply walk. They just walked. And at any given time, he could have said, man, this isn't me. This isn't for me. This is not what I thought I was signing up for. But not Elisha. He was committed. To a point that they got to this trip where they're bouncing back and forth, and 3 times he demonstrates and reveals his persistence. And at each stop, others would even point out what was going to happen. And his response to them was, be quiet. Elisha knew what it would take. He knew that he had to stand firm. His commitment was proved. We ought to think about our own commitment. Think about the different things that we commit ourselves to, for better or worse. And some of us, until worse happens. And how we might be on fire for Jesus. Man, he's done this awesome thing in us. And maybe we've been in this room and we're just very inspired about something. And then we go out and there's like real stuff that's going on. and hard happens. Some of us can't wait to jump into the baptistry. Man, this is an amazing thing that's happening. And then our lives as a disciple of Jesus start to happen, and it's not like it was in that baptistry. And it gets hard. There's a couple guys named Chip and Dan Heath, and they did this kind of experiment, which reveals what they call the peak end rule. And they said that they took a group of people through what they called 3 painful trials. And in these different trials they would get this group of people, and they said, all right, your only job is to stick your hand in this bucket of water right here. And that water was set at 57 degrees. It's a pretty uncomfortable temperature for water. The group of people didn't know how long they were going to have to do this. They timed them, and after 60 seconds, they said, okay, you can pull your hand out. Then a little while later, they came to that same group of people, said, all right, you're going to do this again, stick your hand in that water. They didn't know how long, and for 60 seconds, they stuck their hand in 57-degree water, and then after that 60 seconds, they cranked the water all the way up to 59 degrees for 30 seconds, and they said, all right, you can take your hand out. Then they said, all right, for the third trial, you guys get to pick. Do you want to do what you did the first time, or do you want to do what you did the second time? And almost to a person, they said, we'll do what we did the second time, even though it was longer in that water. And so the Heaths asked, why is this happening? And they said it's because of the peak end rule. And the peak end rule says that we judge our experiences, or we rate our experiences at their best or their worst, their peak, or our experience at the end of that experience, the end. And so they made this principle, and they said most often we remember people at their best or their worst, at the peak times, or we remember what our experience was with them at the end of those times. And that helps us because we operate with the end in mind. We know what the end is. For Elisha, he understood that I'm operating at the end. That's what makes the walks, the foraging for food, the washing of hands bearable. Keeping the end in mind helps provide clarity. It helps bring purpose. If you're in my class, I say this all the time, that the period at the end of the sentence is a good thing. It helps us to understand what that sentence is about. For us, we have a period at the end of our lives, and that's a good thing because it provides meaning and purpose to us. Because there will be some glad morning when this life is over. For Elijah, he was there in our text. Elisha was able to see purpose in his persistence. Elijah knew of Elisha's commitment. This is the final part of it. We have a group of people there called the sons of prophets. These were students in prophetic training. And they said, don't you know that your master is dying today? And Elisha says, I know. Shut up. I don't want to hear from you. I want to hear from him. Elisha persists. Even after you're gone, he's showing, I will still be committed to your people. God often uses seasons of testing and persistent pursuit to prepare his people for great responsibility. Where is God inviting you to persist even when it would be easier to stay behind? Is there family we are at a point of giving up on? Do you have a job or do you have a task that you're just ready to drop everything? What about your faithfulness to God? Are you willing to follow faithfully even when the future is uncertain? Even when you don't know how long you're just going to be walking? Well, we get to see the fruit of this waiting, this persistence. We pick up in verse 9. Verse 9 we read, when they crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, ask what I shall do for you before I'm taken from you. And Elisha said, please let there be a double portion of your spirit on me. And he said, you have asked a hard thing, yet if you see me as I am being taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if you do not see me, it shall not be so. And as they still went on and talked, behold, chariots of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. And Elisha saw it, and he cried, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And he saw him no more. Then he took a hold of his own clothes, and he tore them into 2 pieces. At this point in our story, Elijah asks Elisha what he wants before he leaves. And Elisha boldly asked, let me inherit a double portion of your spirit. See, this indicates to us that Elijah and Elisha, their relationship was not just a mentor-mentee. It wasn't just boss and employee, but it was more closely that of a father and son. Every scholar will point out, if you're to go look this up on your own, they will say what he was asking for was what's asked for in Deuteronomy chapter 17. And verse 21 talks about a double portion of an inheritance goes to the older son. And this is what Elisha was claiming. I'm the son here. I want the double portion. Let's see this all the way to the end. We're even told that the people around him are called the sons of prophets. I think that language is used intentionally. We don't exactly know what it is, but most believe it's a small community of faithful Israelites in years of Ahab and Jezebel. Were they a school of prophets? How were they recruited? Were they called the same way Elisha was? We don't know. What we do know is Elisha is saying, amongst these sons, I want to be the oldest. I want this. And so he wasn't asking strictly for possessions. What he was asking for was the life with God that Elijah had, where most are concerned with possessions and inheritance. Elisha was concerned with spiritual matters. Help my life make a difference, even greater than yours. And Elijah responds, you've asked a difficult thing. Why is that difficult? Well, for one thing, when you're dishing out an inheritance, you can only dish what you have. He can't double that himself. But the other thing is a spiritual inheritance. A spiritual thing is a costly matter. It's difficult. Got to understand what you're asking for here. This indicates that Elisha is asking, what he's asking for is not just Elijah's to give. It's God's. Elijah witnesses Elijah's departure in the whirlwind. Let me say that one more time. Elisha witnessed Elijah going up to heaven in a whirlwind. You're not responding the right way. Elisha witnessed Elijah go to heaven in a whirlwind. That's better. Man, I hope we don't become a place that ever gets numb to God's divine activity. Don't get bored with what God is up to. That's a miraculous thing. There's a flaming chariot pulled by horses on fire. It just shows up in a swirling wind, and it picks Elijah up and pulls him into heaven. Don't be jaded by this. May we never become numb to this. To a point that Elisha responds, my father, and he grieves for a period. Let me ask you, what are you hungry for spiritually? Do you settle for enough to get by, or do you boldly ask for more? God honors, I believe with everything in me that he honors those who earnestly seek him. Like a child asking for more, God delights in children who crave his presence and his power. And so we get to see exactly how this happens for Elisha. Picking up in verse 13, and he took up the cloak of Elijah that had fallen from him and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. Then he took that cloak, that mantle of Elijah, that had fallen from him, and he struck the water, saying, where is the Lord, the God of Elijah? And when he had struck the water was parted to the one side and to the other, and Elisha went over. Now when the sons of the prophets who were in Jericho saw him opposite them, they said, the spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha. And they came to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. Here God confirms that call specifically for Elisha, but into the next generation. Elisha picks up Elijah's fallen mantle, and it symbolizes the transfer of authority and responsibility, and is now on him. Elisha's commitment wasn't first to Elijah, it was first to the Lord. He picks up this mantle, he parts the river, and a double portion was confirmed. He immediately tests it by parting the Jordan, just as Elijah did a few moments before. The company of prophets recognizes this. The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha. And when we read of Elisha's ministry moving forward, most scholars will point out he did twice the miracles that Elijah did. Matter of fact, there's more recorded miracles that were in Elisha's ministry than anybody else in the entire Bible except for Jesus. Not only that, he worked for another 50 years in the kingdom in his career as a prophet. Elijah to Elisha was the prototype that we then get to see later on in the New Testament, from John the Baptist to Jesus himself. Every believer carries with them a mantle, this calling that God has put on us. Everyone wants to say it's unique, but it's the same spirit that Elisha receives from Elijah's departure. And we get to inherit that as well. Our faith is confirmed then not through titles, not through church attendance, not through saying magic words, but it's confirmed by the very presence of God and the power of God in your life. Are you carrying your mantle, or are you waiting for someone else to do that? Now, what does this specifically have to do with me? There's a man, his name is David Kinnaman, and he and his team actually did some research on this, and they identified some characteristics of what they call a resilient disciple. And they based it on stuff like we see from in the cycle from Elijah to Elisha. And they said one characteristic of a resilient disciple is this. A resilient disciple experiences intimacy with God, intimacy with Jesus. In Acts chapter 1, we get to see a very similar type of thing. Jesus is standing before his disciples. He's the risen Savior at this point. And he says, man, I'm getting ready to go to a place, but I'm going to leave with you this Spirit. And you guys are going to be my witnesses. And he says into all these places, even up to the ends of the world. And so we see this transfer, this mantle that's being passed from Jesus to his disciples. John the Baptist says, there's one coming after me who's greater than I. Jesus himself says it's advantageous that he departs so that the Spirit will come. This understanding only happens when there's a closeness with Jesus that's prioritized. The Holy Spirit is in full portion. We have God with us. And the call is to make that matter. Another characteristic of a resilient disciple is that they practice cultural discernment. When Elisha takes up Elijah's mantle, he puts it on. He wears it. It's this fur coat or this animal skin coat that's very, very large with this large strap. Everyone would know that there's something about you there. Everyone would notice this. Similarly, we have taken up Jesus' mantle. When Elijah puts on Elijah's mantle, he now takes up his likeness. When we put on this Spirit, we have taken up Jesus' likeness. We are now witnesses of a loving Savior in a sick and desperate world. Another characteristic of a resilient disciple is that they have meaningful spiritual relationships. Just like Elisha to Elijah, resiliency happens in deep spiritual relationships. Kinnaman's team, they observed that 30% of those who grow up in the faith will stop practicing it even though they will still claim that same faith. Where are those who allow their commitment to Jesus affect and infect the rest of their lives? I believe this type of closeness can only happen when we are close to his people, when we participate in the church. Well, another characteristic is that they engage in what they call a countercultural mission. Like the first disciples who took Jesus' mantle, resilient disciples desire the world not to fall away, but return to the Father. How many get swept up in the notions of the world? That they're enamored by its temporary offerings. And how many of us see those temporary offerings of the world and we decide to hate instead of come with the presence of God? Where are those who take this stuff and they live it out? It's not just in church attendance, but who here believes that you are actually the church of God? Finally, resilient disciples have the characteristic of a sense of calling in their life and their work. Resilient disciples sense the period at the end of the sentence. And because there's a period at the end of this life, my life must mean something. I must take advantage of the opportunities in front of me. One of my favorite chapel experiences I ever had was a professor got up and he said, "You all here are trees. Too many of you think that your life with God, your ministry begins later, but it is happening now. Just like a tree does not decide where it's going to go, where it's going to be planted, you bloom where you're planted." Some of you need to hear the call right now to bloom where you're planted. Instead of shopping your mission, it's time to fulfill it. Throughout history, God has continually raised up men and women to carry out his purposes and to do it resiliently, often in ways and through people the world would least expect. The question is not whether God is at work, but whether we will be faithful to respond to that work. Will you endure the hidden seasons of preparation, the walking, where character is shaped and faith is refined? Will you dare to ask God for more? not for your comfort, but for the sake of his kingdom. And when the moment comes, will you pick up the mantle he lays before you, stepping into the sacred responsibility of carrying his mission forward? I dare you to take time to honestly examine your life right now. What spiritual mantles are resting at your feet that have gone unnoticed or unclaimed? I dare you to pray for a holy hunger, a boldness born of humility, and a heart willing to say yes. Then, just as Elisha did, you trust and you obey. You step forward in this mission, knowing that God confirms his calling not just in a single way, but in many ways. But primarily, he's confirmed it through the salvation we find in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because it's in him that we find this salvation and the persistence to live this out. If you need help praying about this, you sit there and go, man, there is a mantle that I got to carry. We're going to have some folks over at our prayer room that would love to meet with you and pray with you through this. If you need help stepping into this for the first time, they would love to help you out with that as well. But right now, we are going to persist, and we're going to praise, and we're going to offer worship to our God who still calls through his Spirit. Would you stand as we sing?